We are the Secretariat to the All-Party Group on Faith and Society, which is chaired by the Right Honourable Sir Stephen Timms, who will be joining us today. And we're also very pleased to have Professor Jim McManus with us, who's also part of the advisory group for FaithAction. So we're going to the home team today to get input and that kind of thing. We will have, I just want to emphasize, you should have seen on your Eventbrite thing, we will have a time for questions after a little bit of a discussion. We've got Professor Jagbeer with us as well. She will do a bit of a response to what Stephen and Jim talk about, and then we'll open up to questions as well. So there should be opportunities for questions. Obviously, you can pop stuff into the chat. That's fine. I can't promise to spot it, but I do have spotter. I think Matt is my spotter today. Matt, give everyone a wave. There you go. He should be looking with furrowed brow as he spots questions and that kind of thing. So let's just introduce our first guests, and then I think we'll kick off with Sir Stephen. He can kick off. So we have Sir Stephen Timms, Right Honourable Member for East Ham and Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group in Faith and Society, amongst many other things. We'll just do short intros at this point. He's also joined by Professor Jim McManus. He's Director of Public Health at Hertford County Council and the outgoing President of the Association's Directors of Public Health. And we have a bevy of professors. We've got Professor Jagbeer Jutita-Hull, OBE. She is a Professor of Sikh Studies at the University of Birmingham. So welcome to you all. We'll kick off, I think, with Stephen Timms, just to talk a little bit about public life in public health and faith.
Thank you, Daniel. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Great. Well, I'm delighted to be involved today, and thank you for inviting me. Thanks for convening this, and I really applaud the initiative of FaithAction in convening this week of activity. And I think this is quite an important moment for us. We've come a long way already. The description of today's event makes the point rightly that the pandemic was a turning point for public sector bodies partnering with faith communities. I think that's absolutely right. This is an area that the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Faith and Society has been very interested in for a long time. And come the pandemic, we saw how local authorities in particular, all over the country, turned to faith groups to help when the crunch came. And observing that, we commissioned from Goldsmiths, University of London, our first report, which we called Keeping the Faith, released in November 2020. So while the pandemic was still raging. And that found that 67% of local authorities had increased their partnerships with faith groups in the first 6 months of the pandemic. And all across the country, rural, urban, inner city, when the crunch came, it turned out it was the faith groups uniquely that stepped up to support their communities. That was where the resilience in communities was to be found, it turned out. I think it was surprising, maybe surprising to all of us, so that was how it turned out, but that was definitely how it turned out. And the local authorities recognized that that was the case. It wasn't just a turning point in quantity. Local authorities recognized the quality of contribution that faith groups were bringing as well. One local authority respondent to the Goldsmith survey, speaking on behalf of many, told the researcher this, and I'm quoting, "My personal admiration for faith groups has gone through the roof just in terms of their commitment there. We as a local authority didn't know what we were getting into, and they've got involved with smiles on their faces, and they've done it professionally." And that was, I think, the experience all over the country of faith groups getting involved. 61% reported a very positive experience of partnering with faith groups. Faith communities that provided very important emergency assistance at the start of the pandemic. 65% of local authorities saying they relied on them to help distribute food. Many went on to become vaccine centres, a source of mental and physical health support as well. One church leader said his church was the, quote, vaccination and a blood donor centre for the whole town. Trustee of a London mosque said, on the last count, we'd vaccinated over 9,500 people. And our reports found local authorities and the wider public sector, national government as well, waking up in a new way, I think, to the value of the contribution that faith groups can make. Local leadership, large pools of volunteers, ability to reach hard to reach groups, being trusted in the local community, not just by their own members, but by people connected quite loosely to them, who know that that faith group has always been there or been there for a long time. That creates a kind of trust that is rare in our contemporary society, and they bring with them as well intimate knowledge of their local area. So the pandemic showed the impact faith groups can have when the public sector doesn't ignore them, doesn't instrumentalize them either, instead partners with them. Now, have those lessons been learned, or now the pandemic is over, are they all going to be forgotten? Well, I think there are some promising signs. The Colin Bloom's review for the government, published in April this year, celebrated the work of FaithAction, the use of round tables during the pandemic, the positive role of faith leaders in the places of worship task force, which FaithAction ran. And it made some good suggestions. It called for a faith partnership charter, which sounds very like the faith covenant that we're all familiar with. It recommended a new independent faith champion to improve faith literacy and partnerships across government departments. We've seen as well a lot of the partnerships that started or expanded in the pandemic being maintained and strengthened since. Grassroots health and community partnerships, for example. But it isn't all plain sailing. The government hasn't yet responded to the Bloom review. Some people are suggesting they won't get round to it before the election. Its good intentions are yet to be matched by commitment. And of course, for faith groups, the cost of living crisis has not only increased demand for their support, but also made that support harder to deliver. Theos, faith-based think tank, has talked about what they describe as a social recession alongside the economic challenges of the cost of living crisis. The average energy bill for a Church of England church in a disadvantaged urban area, it was 6% of its income in 2019. It's a quarter of its income now. One mosque in Birmingham told Theos that its energy bills had quadrupled from £60,000 a year to £250,000 a year, and they've had to cut back on their community activity as a result. So that the pandemic provided the catalyst, I think, for a turning point in faith-public partnerships. But the cost of living crisis desperately needs that to bear fruit. We need to carry on showing the value that faith groups bring. We need to sign new faith covenants. I think we've had a new local authority signing up to the faith covenant in the last couple of days. We need to celebrate the crucial grassroots work of faith groups. I think we should be encouraging the government to get round to responding to the Bloom review, making sure that ministers don't forget the vital and unique role that faith groups need to be playing. Let's make sure that that report by Colin Bloom doesn't get buried and forgotten. And we need to remember the hard-nosed practicalities of faith groups' work. We need to be honest with government, local and national, about the costs that come with delivering those benefits that faith groups are uniquely able to provide. And financial support in the cost of living crisis could help avert a social recession as well as an economic one. So there's been a lot going on. I think there is a lot for us to be really pleased about, but I really welcome this opportunity for discussing all these matters with everybody in this hour this morning. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Stephen. And I want to turn to Professor Jim McManus. Jim has had a particular key role as a key figure within public health responding to the crisis. But I'm sure, Jim, you have some thoughts about lessons learned and where we should go on from here.
Yes, I mean, I think there's part of me wants to say what Stephen said, so you don't need me to talk, but I will because I'm here. I think there's several things. It seems to me there are several themes that we need to think about, and all of them for me are kind of informed both by science and by faith. So I'm currently researching a doctorate in theology on the links between, on working as a public health professional of faith, and where the links between public health policy and science and faith come in. From a Muslim perspective, Hashim Mahmood has already done an MPhil at Birmingham on something quite linked to this topic. And I guess I'd make several sets of points. I think the first thing is public policy still instrumentalizes civil society and institutions of civil society like faith communities, rather than necessarily looking at them and us as partners. And there is a lot of scientific literature on partnership, and the best literature on interagency partnership is actually on the private sector, because it gives us two lessons. The first is that each side of a partnership needs to understand the value that they're looking for and the value that the partner is looking for. And I think the second thing is that each partner needs to understand their capability and their role in pursuing that shared value. And too many public sector partnerships don't look at that. They look at instrumentalizing where we're going rather than looking at that. So I think Stephen makes a very important call for us to be partners. And there is a lot of science and good practice behind and underneath that we could follow. I think that brings me on to the issue about faith in public life. And I do think we still struggle with the fragmentation of keeping faith separate from practice. And that's artificial. And it's not backed up by the scientific evidence either. And I say that for the following reasons. I mean, I've worked in chaplaincy guidelines and chaplaincy policy for the Catholic bishops for over 20 years. And I've worked on non-religious and humanist pastoral care policy at end-of-life care. And in all of them, actually, what comes across is that if you completely divorce faith from practice, what you get is people who can't be authentic in the workplace, and therefore that affects their performance. And there is scientific evidence for that. So when you bring your whole self to a situation, there's good psychological evidence about authenticity, about consistency across your values, because we can't leave our values at the door. There's also good psychological evidence that if you can bring your whole person to work, your motivation is harnessed by the work, whether it's paid or voluntary. Now, we know that with other equality groups and other equality populations, so that everybody should be able to bring their whole selves to work. But for some reason, we still privatise faith. And we've got to get more adult about this. And that is a challenge. I think the third thing is that, particularly in public health, if I take the example of public health and Catholic social teaching, although public health is a science, its values are actually philosophical. And there is a huge amount of contiguity between the public health values that I suppose as a public health person, and the values that Catholic social teaching, for example, would offer to me, particularly around things like flourishing, around things like looking at the wider determinants in prevention. And I think often public policy is missing a trick by not explicitly engaging with those in the way that other nations do better than we do, particularly the Germans. I think there's a whole pile of false dichotomies. You look at the culture wars that we have, and that's often, I think, driven by domination rather than service. And you'll be aware in America that there's a huge amount of theology and public theology being done around neoconservative ideology that would privilege Christianity at the expense of other faiths. I think that's a false dichotomy, and I do think we have to go back to finding contiguity of values. There has been a great deal spoken about the virtues in public policy, and I think that offers us a way through the virtues of justice, the virtues of dignity of the human person. And I was privileged this last year to be part of a group that has been looking at practicing virtues in leadership. It was a joint diploma offered by some universities in Rome, some papal universities, called Joint Diploma Service in Leadership, or Service Through Virtue. And it's explicitly looked at repositioning our leadership as people in public life based on virtues. I have to say that was really like a shot in the arm for me, and I do think it brings opportunities for us. On Saturday, I was with Positive Faith, which is a faith group that was celebrating its 20th anniversary of working by, with and for people with HIV, and I've been an advisor to their board for some time. And one of the things I was asked to do was explore the science behind peer support for people with HIV. And I summarised the science by reference to St. Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus actually says, look, you're the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And I talked about salt and light. The role of faith in society, I think, is often to be salt, to add flavour, to add something. You know if salt is missing. You also know that salt can actually allow other contributions of a dish or other contributions of a drink to actually play their part and be more present. So there is something about civil society missing how we are salt, but also I think us sometimes needing to get over our importance and actually look at serving and being salt. And then there is also something about light. Support groups are very good at helping each other understand a way forward through difficult situations. And there is a lot of social psychological evidence behind that. So the idea that faith communities are purely instruments, I think, is an impoverished view that doesn't sit with scientific evidence. And I'll finish by saying, I think we need to get back to what Stephen called for, is looking at partners in terms of both the value we're after and the value we bring, and our capability in having an adult discussion around that. I think particularly after the pandemic, we are in danger of losing the lessons that we gained about what faith communities do. But also, I think we have to be aware that those of us who are people of faith, I think, need to be comfortable actually talking about the fact that our motivation and our authenticity comes from our faith, not just from our presence in public life. And that one can have multiple different diversities. I'll finish by saying that outside my day job, I'm a trustee of a hospice, which is a faith-based hospice. And we have done quite a lot of different work in this area on building people, understanding our values as a hospice and understanding how those make a difference to what we do. We're not just another hospice, we're a hospice that actually does it because of our motivation and our values. I'll stop there and hope that was vaguely coherent. And I've just noticed I can't see anybody else. So either you're all going, get off, you're boring, or I'm talking to myself.
Thank you, Jim. No, that was very coherent, and I think just kind of added another depth. I want to pick up on a few points and then hand over to Jagbir to give a couple of reflections for a few minutes before we open up for questions. But I think that the whole essence of what this whole concept of partnership over instrumentalization is, that I can say it, that put my teeth in, is what I think keeps coming up again and again. I think we noticed from a Faith Action perspective that there was certainly during a point of emergency, and actually, of course, we had COVID, then we had the Afghan crisis, then we had Ukraine, we've had cost of living. It's kind of crisis to crisis. There is a surprise often in other sectors about the robust and integrated nature and value of faith. But I think not just seeing it as let me just press this button and faith will spring in, or let me pick up the bat phone and they'll be available, to actually realize that does come, and the reason why it's available, the reason why it's integrated, and the reason why it's first in and last out is all related to faith itself. So it would seem to us that one of the things we're consistently trying to say to potential partners, whether that be government, local government, even private sector, is that faith is not just for crisis. We used to say, I think it's the Dogs Trust that said the dogs aren't just for Christmas, but in this sense, faith is not just for crisis. And actually part of the issues we see, and part of the reason we keep coming back to crisis, is because we're not dealing with long-term issues, whether it be those things that are broadly under the term levelling up, whether it be social mobility that seems to be limited to certain people in certain places, whether it's health disparities or all those kind of things, that unless we engage with all of civil society, and particularly the roots that faith can give, that's really key. I think there's a responsibility on us coming from a faith perspective to realise we're not just food banks, we're not just medicine delivery, we're not just that there actually is longer term walking alongside the things that Jim was picking up in terms of peer, but also then the values that come in. But anyway, let me turn over to Jagbir and hear her reflections on what's been said.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Stephen and Jim. Some thoughts that I have reflecting on some of the comments that you were making. One of the reasons prior to COVID that faith communities weren't engaged properly, as I would say, by local government or public bodies, was the fear that faith-based organisations might be I can never say the word, proselytizing and judging others. But what the COVID pandemic and other campaigns also, like, say, for example, organ donation, shows that faith communities encourage and invest their financial, human, and spiritual resources in supporting local efforts to improve the well-being of their communities. And that's not just their own community, but it's also the wider community that they are situated in, whether that's with reference to public health or whether that's with reference to economic well-being. And with reference to the Sikh community, I think, and Jim was talking about values, the whole concept of recognizing the divine in everyone, but also the whole concept of selfless service guides us in our participation in engaging with these kinds of activities, whether it's food distribution or whether it's working within our communities to raise awareness about certain health issues and everything. And this was demonstrated by the Sikhs when you saw Luton Gurdwara become a vaccine hub during COVID, like many other Gurdwaras and places of worship. Nishkam Trust in Birmingham also ran a vaccination hub, but they've also engaged in a number of other health campaigns for the local community prior to COVID and now after COVID. So there has been that engagement by faith communities before and after COVID. And the one thing I do want to say, while COVID has galvanized stuff, things were slowly changing prior to that. You had the organ donation campaign, you had the mental health campaign, and now we're seeing that carrying on as a result of COVID. Stephen mentioned Collins Bloom report, and I agree that there needs to be a response to the Bloom report, but also a recognition by government in their response of the importance of faith communities in addressing situations and their engagement with public bodies on addressing inequalities or health discrepancies. But whilst I recognize the importance of recognizing what communities do, there is also the conversation that we need to have about how government and local bodies are going to support communities in providing and engaging on issues around cost of living crisis or health discrepancies and everything. Faith communities have always utilized their own resources, but in the current climate, we need to consider how they will be supported to address more, and it's a lot more in terms of the needs that they are having to address. So there's something that needs to be done there. And there has to be what I also call with public bodies. And I'm raising this question now, raising this point now, because we are seeing local bodies, particularly councils, going bust. Right, Birmingham City Council has got with their debt crisis and everything. How will they continue to engage with faith communities? Is this just, okay, we'll have a partnership, but we cannot resource you? That's, I think that's untenable and unworkable. There has to be a true engagement, and you have to have an honest engagement to forge what I would say strong and sustained partnerships between public sector agencies and faith-based organizations, where you have those difficult conversations. You can have those conversations, yes, we like what you do and we recognize the importance of you, but there has to be those conversations about, we will support you, this is what we can do, but that's the limit kind of thing. And I'm just thinking about Birmingham. One of the good initiatives that has come out with their engagement with faith communities, and I think that's as a result of COVID, is that they've developed healthy faith-setting toolkits, which are to help faith leaders to build health improvement in their communities and everything, in terms of physical and mental health alongside other health issues. So, yeah. What I see is that public bodies need to engage with faith communities, because these faith organizations can strengthen the public body's knowledge of the religious demography, institutions, and relationships. And this facilitates a more effective engagement with faith communities. They also need public health communities and governments need to have a proper and sustained engagement with communities. So if during COVID we had those faith roundtables, as soon as COVID was declared as being ended, those have stopped. Those should be continued, because you're asking us, faith communities to address the issue of the cost of living crisis, but you're also asking them to address issues around certain forthcoming issues around, say, for example, autism or dementia, loneliness, or problems with social care system. You need to have those conversations, and you need to provide a venue and a way of doing that. And I think also what I would say is that, on a final note, is that you can't just expect faith communities to do it because that's what they've always done, and they won't stop doing it. But you have to have that genuine conversation of how you will support and help that to be done. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Jagbir. Thank you. Appreciate that. And so we want to turn over for some questions now. So please do use the hand up function so that we can start to take some questions. That'll be good to hear some very interesting thoughts there, kind of firing off in lots of different directions. I think even that simple point towards the end about the round tables that took a while to come together, but not continuing those conversations. I know certainly the one that Jim and I were part of, I was constantly prompting government to say, hey, we need to have that roundtable, and invariably a week or two afterwards they would call it together, normally on a Friday afternoon with a few hours notice, which is kind of, it doesn't really speak of partnership and possibility, but we know that everyone's busy, but there's a way of planning and making sure these things happen. Let's take opportunity to take some questions. We've just got Jim and Stephen with us until 12, so we want to kind of nip in some questions as soon as we can, and if you can keep them short, I will keep Chair's prerogative about cutting you off if they are short, to looking for questions as opposed to speeches. There may be some that have come up in the chat that I might turn to Matt to kind of summarize some in a moment, but let's just see. You should be able to use the hand up function, although my understanding is now if you wave your hand that Zoom assumes that you've got your hand up anyway, because I wave my hands and I keep finding my hand up function has happened. But if you want to ask a question, here we go. It looks like it's Bobby there. Bobby, if you want to come in with, if we take your question and we'll take Maria's question both together, that'll be good. Bobby.
Hi, thank you. And thank you for letting us attend this meeting today. It's very interesting. And I'm really keen to get more of an understanding about how we work with women within the faith leads. As the majority, I was reading 85% of the faith leads are men. And some of the stuff that we engage about, I'm from NHS Kent and Medway, and in the engagement team. And we've engaged about some perinatal health inequalities. We're trying to encourage maternity connectors within our area. And we've been, really, we've established relationships before where we've done the sort of things that cover everyone, like COVID or other things that we bring to the table, or if somebody asks us to attend one of the interfaith groups or what have you, we're happy to do that. But
no, great. That's good, Bobby. I'm going to take that. How do we engage with women? I want to just pin that. We will get one of my team will contact you also about the BME maternity outcome program that we're doing on behalf of the NHS. So we'll get you in contact with that. But thank you. We'll take that question as is there. Let's just jump on and grab Maria's question, and then we'll come to the panel to give their responses. Maria.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your wonderful speeches. I put my question in the chat as well, but it was basically just about how do we express the need to different government officials and different organizations about the fact that action doesn't come as a result of us asking something of others, but it actually comes about as a result of consultation and deep dialogue and discussion about what is the reality and the needs of our different communities in the UK. And we need a multitude of voices to actually come up with solutions or action or like lines of action that make sense for everyone. But often it's really difficult to express that in a concise and succinct way. And I was just wondering what people's experiences have been in expressing that or, like bringing that about. Okay,
great. Thank you, Maria. I don't think that was bad for conciseness. It was good there. Let's first of all we go to Stephen and then hear from Jim and Jagbir on those.
Well, I can see there's a question in the chat for me about if Labour wins the next election, will we commit to employing an independent faith champion as recommended in the Bloom report? Well, I'm afraid there is no such commitment at the moment. I mean, the recommendation in our Keeping the Faith report was for a faith commissioner. And the office of the faith commissioner, and that's an idea that I will be continuing to champion. Whether I'll be successful, I don't know. There isn't at the moment a commitment along those lines. On Bobby's question, I'd be very interested to know whether engaging with faith groups in Kent has been fruitful in engaging with women, or was your point that your experience has been more that it tends to be men who take part in these things, or what's your experience been of that?
Well, thank you. It has been that when we've engaged before, it was with the faith leads who are in the majority men. When it comes to us asking to engage about maternity in particular, we've worked with groups that have direct links. You know, we've had really good work with the mosque and the Gurdwara. But some of the other groups, we haven't been able to get through just to even, engage in that part. So we reach out and we have worked with these groups before, but nobody's taking a bite. And it would be useful to know how we can sort of open that up so that we can engage more, or, encourage, for us to be involved with women within the group, to share information or at least get their feedback about something that could be really important and helpful.
Well, there may well be some good experience on the call about that. One thing which just struck me in and this is perhaps only tangentially related, but one of the findings from our Keeping the Faith reports was there was a bit of a worry that if you're engaging with we wanted to ask local authorities about their experience, and one of the concerns which sometimes is raised, that if you talk to faith groups, you might find yourself, quote, expressing, or the respondents expressing socially conservative views which sit uneasily with our equality obligations, and that, from the research during the pandemic, turned out not to be the case. So I would very much hope that the faith channels do provide routes to engage effectively with women as well as men. But it'd be interesting to hear about experience around the call on that. On Maria's point, I think you're right. There's got to be just deep conversation and dialogue, and people have got to listen to each other. And there is one of the great strengths, I think, of that faith groups bring to these exchanges is they are trusted in their community. I was talking to somebody last night about experience in Brent, and faith groups do stand out from other groups in that people trust them, and their own connection with that group may be a pretty loose one. They're certainly not necessarily going to be people who are there every week, but the fact that they're there and they've always been there means something really important to people, which builds trust. And I think that's what local councils, for example, need to recognise, increasingly I think are recognising, and makes those discussions that Maria was talking about particularly important.
I just want to take the opportunity just to give Jim a last 60 seconds because he has to go, and just see if there's any particular response to Jim you want to give before we dance off. You're muted at the moment.
It helps if I'm not on mute, doesn't it? Sorry, two quick ones before I go then, and thank you. Speaking as a man, I think some of the issues around engaging women, we have to get better at building women's leadership in faith communities and recognise that without women's leadership, most faith communities would be on our knees and not praying. So for me, there is something about building women's leadership courses. There's something about working through women's groups and networks that are in faith communities. And every faith community does have some women's specific networks that I have come across or worked with. And I think our faith communities are very patient of women specific working, even when the leadership is male dominated. So I think just celebrate that and work with it. And there are networks out there. I think the issue that Maria's asking is, I don't think Maria's asking a question. I think Maria's making a statement and pointing us to an ideal, which is you can't do these things quickly and you need engagement. And in my experience, the world of public policy, whenever I sit in front of either a select committee or a minister, solutions are wanted quickly. And And I think there's two ways around that. One is we need to articulate that we can't do everything quickly and we need to build the groundwork. But secondly, are we a solution? If we can do the groundwork, can we help build the solution slightly more quickly than if the groundwork had not been done? And the third thing is, can we articulate those solutions that can happen while also maintaining that you still need to build community, culture and infrastructure, and that's not short term. Because actually, if all you ever do is the short term, you never make long-term change. So I would say to Maria that this is a tension I probably live with every single day, both in my day job and in my work outside my day job and in my ADPH national role. And I think as faith communities, we should embrace it and try to run with it as a service. And thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I see that Jeff's popped his hand up, so we'll take Jeff's question, but I know that Jack-B, you'll want to speak to some of those as well. So let's hear Jeff's question, then we'll get a response from Jack-B, and then we must move on to our next panel because people are coming in for that as well. So Jeff, sorry, you're on mute.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you for the speakers. I mean, I'm calling from the Multi-Faith Centre in Derby, and we're trying to develop a faith alliance in the city of Derby, and we call on sort of FaithAction quite frequently for advice and support. I mean, I guess we're struggling in the sense that there is no shortage of stakeholders wanting to work with faith communities across so many agendas. The risk is how faith communities, how you build an infrastructure to support faith communities so that they can engage with these agendas. And we are really struggling with, well, we've done the work with faith communities, we've connected faith communities, we've created momentum, we've created a sense that we're stronger together, that we want to work together, that we want to contribute. But the assistance with the how do you translate that into partnerships and collaboration? Because we've got so many demands and so many competing interests that it's almost like, where do you start? You know, we've identified so many priorities that faith communities are being asked to engage with, but we have no resource. You know, we are, you know, we're trying to hold these conversations together and keep this momentum going. But we're at a point where it feels like we are getting further and further and further stretched, just trying to sort of maintain the conversations across an ever-growing set of agendas. And I was just wondering whether there's any case that can be made for some sort of form of transition support, because it feels like, in local authority terms, the apparatus that we've all known and loved over the years is being dismantled for various reasons. But what's going to replace that? And that's almost like the opportunity for faith communities to imagine what kind of apparatus we need to create and how we can support that. So in Derby, we're looking at, well, is that the Alliance's role to sort of be that voice of the strategic voice for faith, put in those accountability frameworks, and then work, you know, so to work with the commissioners and have those kind of partnership conversations. But then ensure that.
Thank you, Jeff. I think we've got the essence of it. So let's just turn to Jack-B there in that sense. I'm sure you want to reflect on a couple of other things. Just ask my responders to keep their answers tight as well, if you could. Jack-B.
I think the question with reference to engaging with women, I think that's so important, because a lot of the work that religious communities do or is done by women, right? So you need to have that voice at the table, because they can help and advise and guide on what are the key issues that are affecting their community. Now, there are certain faith groups which don't have that religious female leadership, but that's where you kind of have to tap into what I would say other resources to try and organize those connections and get access to the women. One of the doctors that I see on TV, Dr. Nigat Arif, right? She comes on Good Morning TV and talks about women's healthcare issues. Now, she will probably have a resource or a knowledge of women of faith from within the Muslim community who can advise and guide, or who people could talk to. That's one way of getting in and getting the women's voices heard at a seat at the table. The other way is that we have various organizations, interfaith organizations, where there must be women representatives on there that you can that you can engage with. The other final way is that you look at, are there academics or are there professionals who are working within their community who we can speak to? They might not be religious leaders, but they are part of the faith, and they might have access to that knowledge and provide it. So, for example, if somebody was asking me, who are the Sikh women that we should be speaking to, I could cite off 6 names, right, on the issue of menopause and healthcare, etc. So you've got to be innovative in terms of how you get those women of faith at the table to have those conversations. The question that Maria raised about engaging with policy people, it's difficult, but you have to just continue at it. The one thing I do find sometimes disconcerting and frustrating is the changes in terms of people in particular roles. So you're having a conversation with one individual, and then you go back for another meeting, and it's somebody else that you're having to. There needs to be a consistency in terms of being able to have a conversation from point one to from point X to point Y, so that what you're discussing is heard at all levels and doesn't get lost as a result of different people being in the room.
Thank you, Jagbir. And I think just a little quick reflection related to Jeff's thing is, I think one of the things we have to reinforce, and it's certainly something we say both in the voluntary sector as well as from faith perspective, is volunteering doesn't come for free. There is this perception that somehow you can just access volunteers or faith workers and suddenly things are there, but actually there has often been a lot of investment behind the scenes, and that's one of the things that would be a challenge for potentially a new government or whatever government we get after the election, is to see that you can't just keep whittling away and things will be picked up. I want to give Stephen a last opportunity before he has to go to make any comments. In terms of other responses and things, I know that there's many people on the call that probably want to offer your own answers. Do put stuff in the chat box. And I think in terms of the questions today, just say that from a Faith Action perspective, many of these things we would proffer our own answers and we'll be able to connect people on those things. So do be in touch aside from the call today on these things. And we'll put up the details of some of the programs we're doing, particularly related to women and health as well, because I think there's particular interest on that side. But let me just give a chance for Stephen to make some remarks before we move on to the next panel.
Thank you, Dan. I thought I'd just mention there's quite a big programme which we're calling Faith in Labour, picking up the question about what the Labour Party might be saying. Quite a big programme underway at the moment. We've appointed a series of faith champions, and I think people will see much more effort on the part of our party and quite likely other parties as well at kind of engaging in the run-up to the election on a faith basis, welcoming contributions to our political thinking which come from an explicit faith starting point, which we've tended not to do that in the past. I think we're going to be doing more of it in the next year or so, and I hope that's going to be a positive experience for the party and for those engaging with us as well.
Great, thank you, Stephen. We're going to turn now to our next panel. So we've kind of done that in some ways the top level view, looking at policy and those kind of things. So we want to turn now to looking at faith in practice stories from local collaborations. And I'm pleased to be joined by Jahinga Malik, who is from Mercy Mission UK, Paul Woodman, who's from Love Southampton, and Nadia Khan, who's from Brent Council. So we're going to take opportunity to hear about some stuff happening on the ground and that kind of thing, and we'll whip through hopefully though their time, and then after a little while we'll have the last portion of our meeting together will be again an opportunity to ask questions. Do have them ready to go as you hear people speak and different things, and but please trying to keep them nice and tight, so we can get as many in as possible. Let me turn to Jahinga first of all, who I believe I've seen. I think he's jetted in from another meeting. Hi, Jahinga, great to see you.
Good afternoon. Yes, I'm sorry I wasn't able to join from the very beginning. I was speaking at a Goldsmith University on the intersectionality of faith and youth work. So, which is something that I've just recently been involved in and I'd like to pick up. So thank you very much. And it was good to see Stephen Timms on there as well, mentioning the Faith in Labour event that was a launch of the sort of work in faith in Labour within the faith setting as well. So that was on Tuesday night, I think it was. So very good. Locally, I think some of the really interesting points that have been mentioned, and I'll try and keep them sort of brief as it were. I was the program director for the Voluntary Community Sector Emergency Partnership during COVID at British Red Cross, and we had a consortium of about 250 organisations come together as a voluntary sector to coordinate the response with the interface of voluntary sector. And there was an amazing, so one of the reflections on that was that, as we all experience, and the backdrop to all of this is that I think definitely from a Muslim community point of view and from faith communities across the country, it was a game changer. It was a pivotal moment. It was a change. It was a time of national solidarity and a demonstration of how we work, how we come together, and in terms of national crisis, how organizations, communities, and faith communities work together. And that was sort of brought together on the auspices of with the NHS in Birmingham and the likes. And we were kind of hoping that would be the new norm, and that's the way that we'd work together, because we'd all, hands down, every single sector of our sort of organization structures recognized that this was a really good model of working together. Sadly, I think, there's a tendency to revert back to what it looked like pre-COVID, and don't know how much of sort of during COVID experiences we've been able to hold on to. But the reality is that, for example, in West Midlands and Birmingham, there has been a concerted effort because structures have been put in place to ensure that sort of continues. And, Faith in Action is a very instrumental, played an instrumental role there, because we'll have the faith covenants being signed by in Walsall, another local authority, keeping the momentum going. So when the spotlight is on and there's a national crisis, then it's easier to do this work because there's an ability to be able to come together and, less questions asked and resources are available. When that spotlight has moved on, it's become harder. And so the organizational infrastructure to keep that going is absolutely critical. And as Jeff was pointing out there in Derby, without that, you're going to really struggle. And so with the Mayor's office and with lots of other things, I see Amrik on the call here, a lot of work has been been happening to ensure that continues. And one of the mosques and centres that I've been working with recently in Birmingham, Green Lane Mosque, has increased its, the Birmingham City Council, as you all know, unfortunately has declared bankruptcy. So in actuality, the load is going to be carried by the voluntary sector and the faith institutions such as the Nishkam Centre and also Green Lane Mosque and churches and everything else around the country. So the demand is just going to increase with the cost of living crisis, with all the situation that's fine. So it's not sadly, I don't really have a pretty picture to paint at this moment in time, especially when it comes to Birmingham. Hence, the requirements to step up and serve. And that step up and serve is exactly what we've been trying to do in our different settings. But coming together in this faith frameworks is really, really key and critical. So if we take the young people that situation in Birmingham, parts of East Birmingham, Smallwood, the Green Lane Mosque has been involved in numerous projects that help bring young people together and try and help untap potential and deal with sort of a variety of different factors that helps them unlock their potential, working with local authorities, working with the NHS, working with Macmillan Cancer Support, working with a number of service providers. So the fundamental point here is that the institutions are anchored in their communities, well placed to work with others, and they do so best when they learn from others and work collaboratively, and then they that strength grows in that service provision. It is not by any stretch of the imagination perfect in any stretch, because young people are often excluded, women are often excluded, and so then we have to work on ensuring that it has a approach in which that as many of young people as possible, or people that are excluded, are part of that process. But what we experienced, for example, at Green Lane Mosque in a community centre in Birmingham, is that it is ideally placed and has a heavy burden to ensure that in light of financial collapse in the city of Birmingham, that we come together, we work together, and if really pick up the pieces again to sort of ensure that the future for young people is at stake. And so one example of that was with the establishment of a youth provision and a youth centre. The important thing of that youth centre is that it works with local authorities and the likes to ensure that it's open access for all. I think one thing that has definitely registered and landed firmly in the heart of institutions and mosques and centres across the country is that these centres are not just for your own faith congregation. COVID has opened the doors wide open to ensure that, hey, we're a part of a wider constituency, wider support base, wider needs, and we have to meet all of those. Hence the food banks that Jagbir was talking about, the service provision, the domestic violence, the cancer research, cancer support, the West Midlands Police Crime Commission, all of these services that are being provided, largely self-funded given the kind of situation that's taking place. However, for it to be able to continue, the collaboration that's been happening as a result of kickstarted by COVID has to continue. And for that to be supported, we have to look at other creative ways of funding and modeling that, so that these services, which are increasingly in need, are being able to be performed, but in a way that is serving all of communities and all of societies together. And I think there's some fantastic examples happening in one I picked out in Birmingham at this moment in time, Green Lane Mosque. And so I think under a very difficult backdrop of challenging situations, and financially and politically and otherwise, the work continues in places like Birmingham to demonstrate the social value impact of faith institutions in that setting. So I just thought I'd share some sort of practice of what that looks like within a Birmingham setting. And there's a particular effort happening at this moment in time in trying to reach young people in the most deprived of communities, meeting some challenges at this moment in time, unfortunately, but that's the effort that's taking place at this moment in time. And I'm quite optimistic that can be a good model of excellence right throughout the country.
Thank you, Jahinga. Let's go straight on to Paul Woodman of Southampton. Thank you, Jahinga.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks for the invitation, and nice to see everyone on the call today and to hear stories of faith in action and faith around society. So I am in Southampton, and Southampton is not as big a city as Birmingham, Leeds, but it is pretty deprived. So it's more deprived than Leeds and Sheffield. So it has its own problems. And during COVID, that's obviously made things worse in the city. So the inequalities that were there have only widened as a result. So 2020 was a strange time. I was thinking I might have a quiet life, but it never quite happened. So in 2020, the food supply was one thing, which I guess was true of a lot of cities. There was not an ability for local government here to be able to distribute food as was needed to people that were clinically vulnerable. And so churches and other faith groups got involved in distributing food all through the pandemic to people that were isolating and staying at home. So there's a massive mobilization of volunteers and people at a very short amount of time, and food space to become available. And then following on from that, in a very short amount of time, there was the move for rough sleepers to be taken into bed and breakfast. There were 55 in Southampton, so we don't have a huge problem, but still quite a number of people in bed and breakfast, and we were asked to provide lunch and dinner for them. So we did that for 4 months. Again, just a mobilization of 1 or 2 days to get that up and running, to get food that was provided very kindly, quite often by restaurants and other places that were shut down to help us to feed people. And so, as we talked about, like through COVID, for many cities, churches and faith groups played a big part in doing that. And then coming into 22, 2022, we received a grant from Faith New Deal called Faith New Deal from Department of Levelling Up, and they gave us money to look back on what we've done over the last couple of years. So we've written a report. It's on our Love Southampton website on the impact of charities on food distribution and the role of faith groups in that. So we wrote a report, got an independent researcher in to do that. And then secondly, we ran a cost of living summit. So we went from COVID, as we all did, into cost of living. And we pulled together a couple of hundred people last October to look at the problem of cost of living and what we could do last winter, and mobilised around 60 warm spaces in every postcode across Southampton to help people get through that dark and cold winter that we had last year. And so coming into this year, a lot of those partnerships that we've had through the last 3 years have continued. So I noticed on the call is Joe from the fostering team. So we've been doing work together to promote foster carers over the last 10 years. And we were together actually last night, just promoting fostering across faith communities in Southampton and looking at that need that the local authority has. And then we're also continuing this work around cost of living, and we've switched focus a little bit this year to look at health inequalities. So what your health outcomes might be depending on where you live in Southampton, or what it might be compared to living here compared to somewhere more affluent within Hampshire, and trying to look at what we as community groups can do to improve those health inequalities. And David Vane, who's from the Council of Faith here, he helped me very much to put together the relaunch of the Faith Covenant last November. And so working with Parvin Damani as well from the Muslim Council, we hosted that, and the bishop spoke. Daniel came down, and we relaunched our commitment to the Faith Covenant, which we originally signed in 2017. I think someone asked in the chat, what does it mean? I think for us, it's an example of trust, that people are committed to working together, both from statutory agencies, local authority, and faith groups from different faiths in the city. And so that sense of walking together, not necessarily always seeing eye to eye, but walking hand in hand and making a difference in our city, is something that we have been working on. So the last thing was just to flag up, David's mentioned about the Peace Walk. And I think some of those things that are very accessible to people are really key for us keeping those relationships strong and connected. So thanks for listening to me and what's been happening in Southampton. You can look at any of our reports on Love Southampton. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And lastly, let's just hear from Nadia, hear a little bit about what's going on over in Brent.
Yeah, can I just share my screen quickly? I've got a few slides.
Okay.
So yeah, you should be able to see that. So yes, thank you for having me. And I'm here to talk about the work that we've been doing at Brent Council with faith communities and climate action. So in 2019, the council actually declared a climate emergency, and we committed that we would do everything we could to reach net zero by 2030. But in my work with engaging with communities, and we can only reach that goal really if all communities are involved in the conversation and taking action. So we work very closely with seldom heard communities, young people and children, and faith communities are a big part of the work that we do, and we partner with an already existing faith climate action group. So as people have already discussed today on the call, that, you know, faith centres and places of worship are hubs of the community. And in Brent, for example, we have 80% residents who follow a faith, and that's much larger than the London average. It's a pretty large number, so we can't ignore that. And we were shown, as has been mentioned already, that the faith communities have a wide reach and influence, and COVID showed us that. But it's really it's beyond COVID. And I wrote a blog recently for London councils about faith communities and climate action. And there's a real need to understand that faith centres and places of worship, they're not just ritual places of prayer and actual physical worship, but they're community hubs. They do good works in terms of, we've discussed food banks and mother toddlers groups, but just generally they are involved in loads of activities, and it's a place where people can come and feel safe and be their authentic self. So we know that faith matters to many people and that it guides our actions. It's part of why we have certain values, morals, and it's so important to acknowledge that and realize that in the work of local authorities. So looking after the planet matters to faith communities. And but we can't ignore that there's huge climate inequality. So a big part of the work that we do is removing those barriers to why faith communities might not engage in this conversation, even though faith communities and global majority communities are impacted the most from climate change, living in poorer areas with lack of green space, increased pollution, and so on and so forth. And also, if they're historically not being included in the conversations of not just around climate action, but generally, they have that lack of trust, and they don't want to engage. So we're doing a lot of work to build that, to have consistency, to work closely with trusted groups, and we're increasing representation on this agenda from members of different faith communities. I just wanted to quickly go over a couple of projects that we are running at the moment. So we have climate ambassadors and faith ambassadors. So as I said, we're working with the local faith climate action group, and these communities, they're grassroots. They're based within the communities itself. They understand the faith and cultural needs of that community. They can advise us on using the correct language and the terminology. And that just helps to make communities more receptive to the messages that we're talking around climate change. And often climate change doesn't mean much to people necessarily, but they will understand climate change through connecting it to their faith narratives and faith stories. So recently we launched a faith climate action plan at the Wembley Sephardi Synagogue. I believe Rabbi Jeff is on the call from the synagogue today as well. And this climate action plan, really, we realized that places of worship and faith communities are in different levels of sustainability, and we didn't want to start lecturing people and going really extreme. So we realized that we have to support people who haven't even started doing anything. So we produce this plan, which is a resource and a tool that allows faith communities and places of worship to look at things that they're doing on a daily basis. As I said, they're hubs of community, so it's not just people coming for prayers. They give food. That's part of their moral values. They feed people. So are they using local suppliers? Are they growing food on the premises if they can? Are they teaching their communities about climate change and encouraging them to take climate action? And are they using their faith teachings that they already have to remind their congregation about sustainable behaviors? So this action plan, we're now in the process of connecting with all faith communities in Brent and places of worship, and going out to either deliver workshops or support them and give advice. So but what's important to mention as well, that these changes are not just good for the environment, but they can help save money and they promote a healthier lifestyle. So we are partnering very closely with our public health team as well, because it's the same message that we're all giving. We also had a climate change and my religion exhibition last year, and it's faith leaders who are talking about why climate change and climate action is important to their faith and what pledges they're taking. And that exhibition is now touring across different faith buildings across Brent. We also put together a From Brent to Bowl cookbook, which is we invited recipes from communities of diverse backgrounds and faith backgrounds to submit recipes and a story behind why in their faith and cultural tradition it's very important to not waste food. And that book as well has been doing really well. It's in our libraries and it's in community centres and it's online. And also what's worked really well is co-producing projects and events with faith communities. So we do a quarterly repairs cafe, but the last one we did it with the Kingsbury Hindu Temple, which is an eco temple, and you just get more numbers, and it brings communities together, because it wasn't just open to the Hindu community, for example, it was open to everybody, and it just breaks down those barriers. We also are doing consultation events in faith buildings. So we've got something around green corridors going on at the Willesden Jewish Cemetery at the moment. We've done a faith leader cycle ride. We offer free cycle training at the Willesden Mosque at the moment, but also we're looking to do it at the Hindu Temple. And we are going around doing climate workshops with places of worship and also training faith leaders to deliver that. We've also created some resources. What we're trying to do is create resources from all the different faiths around climate action. And so we're building that on our website. We're also producing posters around, this one's around reducing your carbon footprint in different languages. And we've got a library of things that just launched recently. So we're also trying to offer translations for those and asking our faith leaders to encourage their community to come and borrow things from the library of things, for example. And we also produce templates, and the communities can adapt them in the relevant language and terminology that resonates with their communities. So our longer term vision is really to encourage faith groups to lead on this area, to be thought leaders around the importance of faith and climate action. And we are working still with faith groups to explore high impact climate change initiatives. We are encouraging sharing between faith groups because, as I said, we have an eco temple who are doing really wonderful things, and they've offered support to other groups. And we want projects to become self-sustaining and visible within the community, but we know that funding and resources is an issue. So that's something we need to explore. And we want the council to play less of a role eventually, and communities are now leading. That is the ideal goal, but we're still very much part and parcel and working in partnership at the moment. And I've just added some resources on faith and climate action here, and I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Nadia. Great. Well, let's take opportunity now to pick up on any questions. We want to see if there's particular comments people want to make in terms of what we've picked up today about practical action in terms of partnership, that kind of thing. I love those photographs that Nadia put up there. Particularly, I was very pleased to meet Rabbi Jeff in person and had my own photograph taken with him. So that was a highlight. It's one of those things where you meet people you've met so many times online and you meet them in person. It's great. So let's just see if you want to pop up your hands. I'll just see if Matt's got any questions to get us going that you've picked up on, Matt. And I'll just make sure I can view everyone. If anyone wants to pop up the hands for questions, we'll just run for about 15 minutes. We'll run, and then people can get on to their lunch. Oh, Matt, you've been pipped at the post. Mark's got his hand up. So let's go to Mark. Mark, let's go. Nice, short, sharp question, if you would.
Thanks. Just struck by both Nadia and Paul's enabling, one from a council side, one from a church side. Would love to get your perspectives on what top tips you'd have for others to find those enablers. And also then when you're doing that enabling, how do you actually gather people in your networks? Are you getting people together? Are you going to people individually?
Let's jump on and see, Paul, if you want to give a quick response to that, and then Nadia.
Yeah, I think building into my diary, I've just put in a little bit of time each week just to be able to meet up with people for breakfast. So I typically just put aside Thursday morning to do that, and then I'm trying to meet with people like the head of housing and other people within the council and the police and so on, and meeting up with key stakeholders just on a regular thing. So it's not necessarily a big part of my week, but it is part of my year that over the year I would have seen 30, 40 or so people and had meetings with them and talked to them about some of their issues that they're facing, some of their budget constraints, some of the problems that they have, and trying to understand them as well as connecting with them. I think the challenge from a faith point of view is I've been in my job for 25 years, but that's quite uncommon within the council world, and so leaders move on quite quickly. So the second side of it for me is writing good reports about what we're doing. So the ones I've mentioned, actually getting impact reports, interviewing people. I've got a report being written at the minute around the refugee work that's happened over the last 20 years. And I'm interviewing key people within the city council to get their take. And they may not be around by the time it's published. It's just the nature of public life compared to church life, but it does mean that it's on record, the things that the faith groups have done. So there are two things for me. I think those private meetings, connecting with people, but then also writing good reports has been two things from Southampton that worked well for us.
Paul, just to give some gritty bits to that, am I right in thinking that within Love Southampton that churches actually put some money aside to make sure that there is that kind of city representation? I'm just trying to remember our conversations in the past.
Yeah, so I think around COVID, we just asked churches if they'd chip in a budget for the next 5 years and asked if we could do that. And we raised that money pretty quickly to put aside money for the next 4 years. And then with the Faith New Deal money coming in, we've got money in the bank for the next year or two. So that helps us a lot. Yeah, and that also gives us a little bit of ability to gather large crowds, you know, so like the Cost of Living Summit coming up, we're working with Solent University to host that here in Southampton, but we'll have some money available from that fund to be able to put in if we need it for speakers and so on.
Right.
So just a little bit of change is helpful.
Yeah, that's helpful. Nadia and Jahinga, I just want to see if you got any further reflections from Mark.
Yeah, so basically where I first started was we have a multi-faith forum, and they are quite active in the borough. They don't always, they want it to be more central. So what we have is that certain teams in the council are working closely with faith communities, but it's not everybody. So I went to them first of all, and they have an offshoot, which is this climate arm. But basically, when we expect sometimes in local government is that, oh, just get on with it, you do your bit. But no, we need to have this partnership. So our team have been working very closely with that Faith Climate Action Group, who are an offshoot of the Multi-Faith Forum. We have monthly meetings, we have a terms of reference. We have a strategy of what do we want to do, who do we want to reach, how we're going to do it. We have a timeline. So basically through that group and our climate ambassadors, and I'm always on the ground. And so we have green neighborhood areas, and I attend local events at the mosque or in community centers. And there you start to build links with the community. They also trust you. They see you. They see you on a regular basis. You're not just sitting in the office and not doing anything. So I think that's been really important. We also take suggestions from the faith community about things that they want to do. So we were asked to host a delegation from EcoPeace, from the director of EcoPeace Middle East, and we're actually doing that next week. And that was a request from the faith community, and because we want to discuss partnership working, sharing information, and best practice around engaging diverse communities. So that's happening. And I have to say, like, social media has been an amazing way, and attending meetings such as this, writing blogs and all of that, in getting the message out on what we're doing. So many more people are online, and that's helped me connect with people in the community, but also people abroad doing things around climate change and different faith communities abroad. Recently, a couple of councils have asked to sit with me about what we're doing with faith communities. So I think that's been really good, and I'm always willing to share what we're doing, because I feel like that impact that faith communities can have on this agenda around climate change is so huge.
Right.
But I also think it's across the board, and that faith community should be involved in all aspects.
Yeah, thank you. And it's very interesting to hear that kind of that formalized response and subgroups and different things happening, and people going to specific people, not just all on the same stuff. I think that Matt himself has got a question that wants to jump in. I don't want to penalise it just because he's part of Faith Action. So Matt, let's hear your question.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, so I was just interested in how in the first session it felt like Jim really drew out that there is a change in mindset that needs to happen on the part of commissioners and the public partners who are looking to engage and collaborate effectively with faith groups. But it also seems like in this latter half, we've transitioned to thinking about how there's a mindset shift that needs to happen on the part of faith groups as well, to not just look to the local authority or the government as the solution to problems, or seeing ways in which faith groups can fill in the gaps, but having that moment of realizing, oh, I can be a part of the solution, or my faith group can initiate something and lead, and therefore being able to establish sort of a level playing field in partnerships. So I was wondering if maybe particularly for Jahangir or Paul, if you have specific examples of moments you've had like that recently or in the past.
Yeah, I think you raised some really good points there, and I think a positive outcome. There's many to mention, but the positive outcome of the way that we all responded to COVID was that relationships have become strengthened. So once our relationships are stronger, then that enables us to be able to work together collaboratively, and again, being very parochial about this. West Midlands and Birmingham have been, have demonstrated a really good way of convening faith actors to come together to be able to sort of move forward, and more recently in cost of living crisis and so forth. So I think the onus sort of still largely lies on the faith communities and the faith leaders and faith assets, but the convening power of, for example, the West Midlands Combined Authorities Faith Strategic Partnership has a really powerful role to play, and that enables us to all come together, and then we sort of move together on sort of tackling the different challenges around our city and around our areas, whichever it may be. So I think the sort of structures that are in place now that weren't in place previously are enabling more work to happen. So that's one thing. And secondly, the relationships that have been forged now, I think it's Paul who was saying that correctly, that in the structures and the local authorities, people change quite frequently, but that's not the case in faith assets and faith structures. Maybe they don't change enough. That's a valid criticism. But coming back to sort of at least you know that the people that you'll be dealing with largely now will be there, hopefully, God willing, next year and the year after, and so there's continuity, because you can't restart every relationship every time you want to do a new project. It doesn't really take off the ground very well because you've established these relationships as a result of it. So structures and key relationships that have been built are really key in enabling us to sit together and work out the sort of potential creative solutions.
Thanks, Shane. Paul, the journey that faith has to come on. I mean, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because obviously from Southampton, you guys have signed the covenant, you've re-signed, but there's just journeys. Maybe you can talk about from Love Southampton or from Southampton generally. There's a journey, isn't there? And I think structures and relationships, I think, are obviously part of that. But any other things to add in there?
I think as people have said, like the crises that we've had a bit of added momentum all the time whenever to our unity movement and sense of purpose. So 10 years ago, it would have been around the cuts to children's services that mobilised the church to find foster carers and work with families and look at youth centres. 3 years ago, COVID, currently cost of living. But I think for me, probably one of the key things we've done, and we've worked with the council, is having more roundtable strategy meetings where, because often, and I said this to Southampton City Council some years ago, that a strategy meeting for them would be, this is the problem, this is our PowerPoint about it, and here's a cup of tea afterwards. So I'm trivializing it a bit, but it wasn't like, well, let's look at our problems, think about what solutions might be coming from the university, from the businesses, from the football club, and so on. So we've led more conferences like that. So 4 years ago, we led one around rough sleepers. We had a rising number of rough sleepers in the city, gathered together businesses, MPs, police, everyone looked at the problem. And some of the things that have been talked about for years, it'd be good if we did this, be good if we did that, suddenly were mobilized within a matter of months. A new website within a couple of months, an app a month later, container homes for homeless people within the year, a charter written within 4 months. And sometimes just convening people together without the council being the lead partner or the church being the lead partner, but all of us having a sense of, we're in this together for the common good, mobilizes a lot of energy, and it draws businesses in, and it draws in the universities, and it means that you get things done without it all resting on a council system, which has bureaucracy built into it for the protection of everyone. But sometimes businesses and charities can work differently. Again, they've got their own safeguards, but it just means sometimes you can crack a nut a different way, and it helps. So our rough sleeping numbers actually came down from 23, I think it was, down to 9 in a two-year period with us all working together. So it was quite amazing. Those figures are all sort of in the public domain. But yeah, that was one thing for us, those roundtable conferences working together.
I mean, there's a whole, just amongst your answer there, Paul, you use a phrase that I would want to debate vehemently, that bureaucracy protects us all. So I think I'd like to fight that one big time, not only because of the focus on trust in the first part of the thing, but that's some excellent points there. I think mentioning the different stakeholders, I think, is very key, and I know that the football team have been very key there in terms of Saints. Although at West Ham, we're very thankful for your provision of a key player for the results we're seeing at the moment. But I won't go too much into football. I think one of the factors I just want to bring out here as we come to an end is this whole concept of faith capital. that there are things, and I know Jahinga has apologised for referring to West Midlands, but let's pick up on Cadbury. I mean, I'm near lunchtime, so it's good to start talking about chocolate. But when we look at the kind of solutions historically for big problems, it's Cadbury and Rowntree and Guinness, for those who partake in that sense, have been key faith responses to things, bypassing government and central stuff, and I think that's very interesting. I just started watching the Stanley Tucci series on Italy, and the first episode looks at how people banded together in a kind of rough estate in Naples to create a restaurant which was funded out and was pushed forward by recipes of people coming together from different cultures and different things. I think we have to recognise, as much as we look to government and see some there is opportunities where we band together, and certainly we've mentioned Nishkan Centre here. I was struck by their builder's yard, which I think was one of their first projects, which was essentially about pooling resources and bringing people together to enable things to happen. There is a lot of resource that we can pull together, and I think that how we approach those knotty issues outside of the kind of, I don't know, the sexy focus is on northern powerhouses and all those kind of things. It's kind of interesting to see what we can do, and I think certainly in terms of the projects that you all have shared, it shows that great power within civil society, and particularly within the faith sector. Our time has gone, and we want to be tight as we can. I want to thank you all for joining us, and thank to the panel, both panels, for joining us, and appreciate your time. There is a lot more going on when it comes to faith in partnership. There's been some mention earlier of Walsall signing the faith covenant today. Actually, Walsall are signing it, but we actually have our first combined authority. The Mayor of West Midlands will be signing the faith covenant, which will take us up to 26 and then 27 with Walsall signing, and that will be the first combined authority to have signed the faith covenant. So we're looking forward to that, and some of us will be racing up, hopefully up the M6 in a minute. It depends what state it's in, just to get there and to be part of that. If you do want to hear more about faith covenants, upon those organizational kind of things, do make sure you tap onto the website. You can go on the faithaction.net website, or Faith and Society, which is the APPG website, faithandsociety.org. We've mentioned a number of different programs and projects here. There's just not time to go through all the things that the Faith Action team are up to and what we do. We have a particular relationship with the Department of Health through the Health and Wellbeing Alliance, and there's some superb work across different people groups there, and we kind of are the faith voice in there. And there's a number of things we're doing also in terms of integration and language. So do make sure you check those things out. We're endeavoured to put some reports and where appropriate, these recordings up. We had another session earlier this week, particularly looking at the power and importance of evaluation and that faith impact in that sense. So that's available. We had Dr. Dan Range lead that session, and I know that was very popular, and people have asked for slides of that, and we'll seek to make those things available. Many of the questions that you've had today would be things that we'd want to try and field and sort from a Faith Action perspective. So do always drop us a line at info@faithaction.net. We're happy to deal with those questions. And if you particularly want to grab me and get me to do some stuff, or if there's a particular thing, particularly around the Faith Covenant, come to assistant@FaithAction, and we'll see if we can provide different opportunities for people to come and speak in different settings. So we appreciate that. I'm seeing a couple of councils online, and we just want to encourage you guys, let's push you over the edge and get some more of those covenants signed, because as we say, faith is not just for crisis. We want to set those things up and have long-term connections. So looking forward to connect with you more, and do keep your eyes peeled. There will be a particular celebration of the Faith New Deal coming up at the end of October, which will be our last Faith in Partnership event, particularly featuring what's happened in Southampton. But if you want to hear more about that, do keep looking at the site for under the hashtag Faith in Partnership, and do make sure you're signed up for the e-news, which comes to your inbox every Thursday and gives you a bit of a breakdown of what's happening. Thank you for your time, and hope you all have a good lunch.